So today I'm talking about codependency in relationships, what it looks like for singles. But first, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So in this video, I'm going to share what codependency looks like when you're single and when you don't have a primary relationship, because it looks different and you have to know what the problem is in order to start recovery. So the first sign of codependency in relationships when you're single is that you probably have a fantasy in your head. If only you had a primary relationship, a love partner, everything would be okay. You imagine that your life would get better, problems would be easier to handle if only you had a partner. This is really easy to fall into because the codependent has an intense need for love, approval, and connection. And when you're codependent, you don't know how to give it to yourself. So you're super focused on getting it from other people. And without that primary relationship, we tend to get lost. So assuming that the love relationship is going to fix everything is a very common thought when you're codependent. Another way codependency shows up when you're single is that you might struggle with feeling more anxious and depressed. And this is really common because without that primary relationship, the codependent person doesn't have a focal point. They feel empty a lot, and their own feelings are really hard for them to navigate. Codependent people tend to look outside of themselves for their own worth and their own happiness. So being alone is quite anxiety provoking. It might feel like you can't be in your own skin and you just can't tolerate being alone. This often goes back to childhood where maybe you were left alone a lot, or there was a lot of pain and abuse going on that you didn't know what to do with, and the way you coped was focusing on being connected to other people. So being anxious or feeling depressed is very common when you don't have a primary relationship, because those feelings tend to surface from childhood where you might feel worthless, you might feel really anxious and feel like you're coming out of your skin at times because the codependent person doesn't know how to be in their own skin, because they find their happiness through external sources like other people and especially their primary relationship. This also makes the codependent much more likely to stay in abusive, toxic relationships because the pain of being alone is so intense, they would rather stay in an unhealthy relationship than face the pain of being alone. Another sign of codependency in relationships when you're single is that unhealthy dependency gets transferred to a family member. It might be your child. You might find that you're super focused on their achievements and how well your child is doing. Or you might be enmeshed with a parent, your mother or your father or an aunt, to give you that love and approval that you can't give yourself. Other ways this shows up is you might glob on to a friend. That's what I did. I globbed on to friends and made them my everything because I needed to stay connected. And that's a very unhealthy sign of codependency, especially when you're single. That may be more likely to happen. Another sign of codependency in relationships when you're single is that you may struggle with a lot of negative thoughts about yourself and self-blame. So you might be telling yourself things like, I'm not lovable, or nobody is ever gonna want me, or I'm never gonna find that person to complete me. And we tend to get really down on ourselves a lot because we don't believe in ourselves, because codependent people tend to have low self-esteem and they have a lot of trouble believing in themselves and their own self-worth. And that's why they tend to focus more on getting it outside of themselves because they don't know how to give it to themselves. So part of what happens when we don't have a primary relationship to hyper focus on is we get stuck in those negative messages that often trace back to childhood that we think are true about us, that you're not enough or that nobody will want you. And those are just not true. And in recovery, you're going to notice that. But that's a really important sign for you to be aware of. Another sign of codependency in relationships when you're single is that you transfer that compulsive energy to your work and you become compulsively busy. You can't sit still. You're spending way too much time and energy on your work or on volunteer jobs and really wiping yourself out, because the pain of being alone is excruciating for the codependent person. I know for me, I dealt with this for a long time and it was really hard for me to identify this as a sign. And if this is a sign for you, I want you to say ditto in the comments, because this is a very important one to identify. Because if you can't stand being in your own skin, that's a problem. I know it was a huge problem for me, and I wish somebody would have highlighted it for me. And that's why I want to highlight it for you, because that tells me that you have to do some work befriending yourself. Because when a codependent person is not in a relationship, they don't know what to do with all that energy. They don't know enough about recovery to put it on themselves and their own self-care and really take care of themselves. So when a codependent person is not in a relationship, they don't know what to do with their free time. So they tend to use it in unhealthy ways, instead of realizing that they could use it to better themselves and to start learning how to validate and esteem themselves. So they overwork and try to find other ways to be overly productive, because that's how they get their value. They also do this to avoid their own feelings. So being compulsively busy helps them avoid the pain. And especially if they don't have a primary relationship and feel worthless because of it, that need for being compulsively busy is going to get greater. Now, the next sign of codependency in relationship when you're single is that you might find that you're relying on substances to cope and to bury that pain. This could be alcohol, any type of drugs, but food is especially common in codependency, because codependency tends to develop as children. And if you didn't get comforted, a lot of times the adults comforted us with food, and especially sugary foods or junk foods, and they become a source of comfort. And so in adulthood, when you're stressed or when you're feeling like you're coming out of your skin or you're super lonely because you don't have a relationship, having excess food or doing what's called binge eating can be an attempt to self-soothe. So finding healthier ways to handle your emotions is going to be key. So the next thing I want you to do is go get my journal prompts on self-care, codependency, and beginning to set boundaries, because that's going to give you a roadmap to start taking better care of yourself as you're recovering from codependency. Thanks so much.